Hello and welcome to Introduction to Museology Week 2. I had some great responses from the lecture material and the lecture last week, so I'm really glad to be back with you guys. I've prefaced this a little bit on Google Classrooms, but just to give you a little introduction of what you're about to see, I've arranged and recorded different discussions with museum professionals around the world and in different museums, so I hope that will give you an idea of the different tasks that museum professionals can take and the different paths that they can take as well. You'll see that museology is not linear and you can take whatever direction you want it to take based on your education and your interests. So I hope these little discussions will be both reflective for you and encouraging. Today's museology guest is Julian Harrison, who is a curator of medieval manuscripts at the British Library. But before I get into the video itself, I wanted to say that Julian, like me and other galleries, archives, and library professionals, he's part of the GLAM sector, which is galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. We are all part of a sector that our mandate is to create knowledge and to make collections accessible for people. I'm really glad I had the opportunity to speak to Julian because he gave an idea of not just what's in the British Library collection, but what people can do with it, both in the British Library itself and researchers around the world. Hi, I'm here with Julian Harrison, who works at the British Library. Can you tell me a bit about yourself, Julian?
Yeah, so hello, I'm a curator of medieval manuscripts at the British Library in London. I've worked there for 15 years, since 2006. I look after the collections of medieval manuscripts with other colleagues. And over the recent years, I've been involved in curating 3 major exhibitions, one of which was the Magna Carta exhibition that we held in 2015. I did a Shakespeare exhibition at the Library of Birmingham in 2016, and I was also the lead curator for our exhibition called Harry Potter, A History of Magic in 2017. And I also helped to edit the library's medieval manuscripts blog, which has a very large international readership, including lots of readers in North America as well.
That's really amazing. Do you have a preference for which exhibition that you enjoyed most?
All quite different. Also, I guess particularly exhibitions, sometimes they take longer to prepare than others. So Magna Carta, for example, took us 4 years. Harry Potter, it was 15 months, I think, from beginning to the time it opened. And Shakespeare, I did it in 4 months. So you're immediately under, different types of constraints as to what you can actually achieve in those times. But all really interesting to work with. I go out to say it's much easier to work with a dead person like William Shakespeare than it is with somebody like J.K. Rowling. In the sense of working with living authors and all the kind of things that you can and can't say, really interesting. But that was a really phenomenal thing to work on, and we really tailored our exhibition to be more about the history of magic, and as it's featured in J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter novels, really interesting thing to be involved in.
Did J.K. Rowling actually talk to you about it? Did you know her?
I met her a couple of times, but essentially
Wow.
she's at the time she was writing one of her Fantastic Beasts films, so extremely busy lady. So we worked primarily with her publishers in the UK, who are Bloomsbury, and with the BBC, who were filming a documentary about the exhibition, and also the Blair Partnership, who represent J.K. Rowling.
Wow, that's amazing. I think you already said it, but what makes the British Library so special?
Well, I mean, I think first and foremost is actually the size of the collections. So we reckon that we hold somewhere in the region of 200 million collection items. And if you compare that with any other museum or library in the world, I've yet to find any institution which holds more items. So from a perspective of a British Library, we don't just hold the National Book Collection, but we hold the National Sound Archive, the National Newspaper Collection, the National Philatelic Collection. We hold the records of the East India Company, and other big major, what you could call international institutions based in London. Say the National Gallery holds maybe just over 1,000 paintings. The Science Museum, a couple of million collection items. British Museum likewise. Cambridge University Library has something like 9 million collection items. I think the only big library which is perhaps comparable is the Library of Congress in Washington, DC. But at the moment, the British Library just technically holds more collection items. And that in turn leads to the diversity of the kinds of, not just the collections that we hold, but the kinds of stories that we can tell. So I'm a manuscript specialist, but obviously we have a really, really majorly important collection of printed items, starting from the advent of printing in Western Europe, but also going back to items such as the Diamond Sutra, which is the oldest printed datable book, and it was printed in China in what would be the 8th century AD.
That's amazing. Can you give us an idea about the kind of research requests you have? You obviously talked about you have all these collections, but what are your most common research requests that you get?
Yeah, good question. So obviously we cater for all kinds of researchers, and obviously in our reading rooms we have visitors who actually come from around the world, and particularly for the manuscripts reading room, we calculate that we have more international visitors than we do from the UK alone. And also we have lots of online visitors as well. We have many of our manuscripts are available online. We have a website called Digitized Manuscripts, and obviously for our exhibitions programs and other related activities, we have lots of different ways of engaging with people. But researchers, some of them are visiting the British Library in order to finish their scholarly studies, maybe their PhDs or even their undergraduate studies, or they're writing monographs or articles. In the case of medieval manuscripts, people often doing really in-depth analysis of how the manuscripts were made, or who owned them, or they're interested in art historical questions. But we get lots of different questions from people who might be looking at medieval manuscripts for the first time in their lives, and they might just have more tangential sort of questions about how manuscripts might be made, or how you can date them and localize them, those kind of questions.
Do you, as a curator, do you get to talk to these visitors, or do you get the request sort of secondhand?
Yeah, a combination of the two, really. Some researchers will contact us directly. Other questions are forwarded to us. As a general rule, we try to help as much as possible. We will also, even sometimes if a question relates to items which actually aren't held at the British Library, we do our utmost to either help them or to point them in the right direction. But we do obviously engage with people and talk to them as much as possible. And obviously, when it comes to actually giving people access to the materials as well, we have lots of items in our collections that you might have heard of, things like Magna Carta, and the Beowulf manuscript, and the Lindisfarne Gospels, and one of the oldest Bibles in the world, which is called Codex Sinaiticus. And obviously these are very precious and fragile items, and we have this really important obligation to look after them and to make sure that they as they have survived for literally hundreds of years in many cases, we need to ensure that they are still able to be examined by people in hundreds of years' time. So we have to be very careful about how they're handled, and to ensure that they are, if they are ever issued to readers, that they are done so in a very sympathetic way, and that we make sure that they are always looked after with the utmost care.
It's interesting you're talking about these huge pieces of literature like Beowulf. I have a background in English and I also have museum studies, so it's kind of combining those two interests. What made you come into the field? Like, what's your education background?
Yeah, so at university I studied medieval history. I studied in Cambridge University in the UK, and I studied a course called Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic, and that combines the study of sort of medieval history, but also with other related disciplines, the languages, paleography, which is the study of manuscripts. And I became a bit of a manuscript nerd, to be honest with you. I'm obsessed with manuscripts, and I discovered that actually if you go and look at the original manuscripts, you quite quickly start to discover things about them that you might not otherwise learn from reading other published articles or editions about them. You might notice, for example, that they've got annotations in them that haven't been recorded before, or you might notice the name of a previous owner, or I discovered quite quickly that you could redate manuscripts by comparing the script with other comparable manuscripts from the same period. And so I quickly discovered that that was the thing that I was most fascinated with. And I was very lucky. I hung around the British Library for a while as a reader in the reading room, and I made myself indispensable there. And obviously, I was very fortunate. A research position became available, and then after a few years, other curatorial positions became vacant, and I was able to apply for them, and that's where I've been ever since.
I think that's important to recognize, because I want my students to realize how you can get into museums as well, and sometimes just showing dedication can be the way to go.
Yeah.
Can you describe some of your daily tasks that you do?
Well, it can differ from day to day in particular, and also from year to year. But at the moment, I'm responsible for a big cataloguing project. As I mentioned, we've got thousands of medieval manuscripts that we look after at the British Library, and we are in the continual process of updating, revising, improving our catalogue records. And that's in particular because for a big institution like the British Library, many of the manuscripts were acquired 250 years ago. And at the time of acquisition, they might have been recorded, but those records are now becoming obsolete. So we're managing a catalogue project at the moment that we are creating sort of new online records for some of our medieval manuscripts. So on a daily basis, I review the catalogue records, I discuss the progress of a project with our cataloguers. We assign different manuscripts to different people depending on their language skills or their particular experience of the different types of manuscripts that they're most familiar with. So that's one thing which is really important, and it probably goes slightly under the radar when it comes to kind of a big high profile projects, but it's really, really sort of majorly important, because as we're going along, we're discovering new things all the time, identifying new texts, discovering new ownership inscriptions. So recently, for example, our cataloguer, he came across a manuscript that in the 16th century was owned by somebody called Hamlet, which I felt was really cool. No, not a name that you normally think was quite common in the 16th century. And then after we published about that, we on our blog, Another archivist got in contact with us from another record office in England, in Norfolk, and she also had also discovered other records relating to the same person, was able to identify him. He was a jailer in Norwich Castle in England, and it was also really interesting to like piece together different aspects of that person's life. And that's just a really good example of how, you know, the work that we do is obviously really important in enhancing and improving our knowledge of the manuscripts, but that in turn has a really significant research impact, and it enables other researchers to actually either enlarge the scope of their own work or you know, find different avenues to pursue for their own research.
Do you hear that a lot about people who have picked up on something you put in your collection and then gone with that idea?
Oh yeah, undoubtedly. And you know, just thinking off the top of my head of another manuscript we recently discovered in the same collection, that it was an unknown copy of a medieval text by a medieval writer called Gerald of Wales. And there was only one known copy of that particular text. And we've now found a fragment of a different copy. And why that is quite important is because another researcher was editing that particular text, producing a critical edition of the text. So for him, that's really, really invaluable to know that there's a second witness that he can compare. And also, it demonstrates that that particular work had a larger potential medieval reception than we could hitherto appreciate.
Yeah, that's amazing. You're kind of answering all the questions I've been having, but can you describe more about what's unique about your work?
Well, I guess having the opportunity to work with medieval manuscripts is really, you know, exciting, and you could describe that as unique because each manuscript is different. Each one is handmade, and that means that each one in turn has potentially a different history from the time it was made to the different people who owned it over the centuries until it was acquired by the British Library. That's true also in particular of all kind of museum artifacts as well. You know, many objects are potentially uniquely manufactured or have a different reception histories. And I was thinking in particular about the types of things that you might be interested in, but I think that one of the things I was going to mention is that the task of a curator, apart from looking after the artifacts in your care, is actually to be able to tell stories about them. I think that's really key, that's really fundamental. You know, like at an institution like the British Library, we do put our manuscripts on display in our exhibition galleries, but ultimately anybody can still come in and actually handle them and turn the pages.
Yeah.
And so they are objects, but they still have a continuing life. They can still be consulted and they can still tell you a story. And as a curator, I think it's your, not just your obligation, but I think it's your actual privilege to be able to be part of that particular journey in enabling people to actually learn about the history of those objects. And then in turn, if you're going to be putting them on display in a larger exhibition, like the Harry Potter exhibition, when you're creating a section to do with herbology, for example, and you're starting to think about all the different types of books that you could actually potentially place together that have never been shown in conjunction, and all artifacts and objects that relate to the history of cultivation or herbology. And that in turn, you know, that is a really sort of unique thing that you can actually do as a museum or library curator.
I agree with you. I think you lead the story a lot in your role as a curator. Like the text can be as it is, but like you say, if you put it next to something or if you display it, you sort of let it have a story of its own.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to remember that museum objects aren't like one-dimensional things.
Yeah.
They do, they are, whether they are things that can be easily handled in one hand, or they are much larger, or they are books which you can turn the pages. I mean, for example, with medieval manuscripts, one thing that we would often point out is that many of them are highly illuminated. In some cases, they can contain hundreds of illustrations and drawings, and they are comparable to some of the greatest artistic pieces from the Middle Ages, whether that might be altarpieces from a church or cathedral, or frescoes in a church or a palace. There are literally hundreds of them that survive, but they've been kept within a bound volume, a codex, a book form,
Yeah.
by which they've been protected for hundreds of years. But they are absolutely fundamental and really important witnesses to kind of medieval art and medieval culture. And that is something that I think we're really sort of, is proud to be part of that story.
Has there been anything in the collection that you wanted to display but haven't had a time yet?
Good question. I mean, obviously, when it comes to like curating a major exhibition, I'm sure that you're aware of that, but always sort of like things that you have to take into consideration when you're choosing the objects to put on display. It's not a simple case of just picking a few books off a shelf and sticking them in a case and hey presto, there you have it. You have to take all things into consideration, like for a book, how well does it open? Which pages should you choose? If it's an older book and it's in a language like Latin, or maybe it's an Arabic, or it's in Old English, you have to take into consideration, can the visitors actually read the language, or have you, as a curator, got to consider how to give them an easy sort of opening into understanding what the manuscript is about? And I'm also very keen, even though I work in a library, that when you put manuscripts on display, I think it's really cool to be able to place alongside them objects that might be from a similar period that help you tell the story. I'm thinking in particular of our Magna Carta exhibition that we held in the British Library in 2015. Obviously, we're really fortunate that we could place Magna Carta itself on display. But medieval documents are often authenticated by having a kind of a wax seal placed at the bottom. The king would never actually sign a charter, but it will be authenticated by having the seal placed. And I remember that we borrowed from Canterbury Cathedral a medieval seal press. The actual thing that was actually used to actually implant the impression on the seal. It was huge, though. I mean, literally, it was about 3 or 4 feet tall. It's very heavy. Requires a couple of people to lift it. But by having that on display, as well as the original medieval documents, actually just gave the visitors that visual prompt of understanding how these items came into being. And I think that's a really good sort of opportunity as a curator to explain to people that objects don't just come about. They are actually created by somebody. And I think that's always fascinating, learning about how things are actually produced or manufactured.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. That's something I think about in my museum studies too. You're talking a lot about handling physical objects. How has working in a pandemic affected that?
Well, obviously, for a long time, the British Library buildings were closed to visitors and staff alike. The very good news is we're open again now. So it's as I'm speaking, it's August 2021, and our reading rooms are open, and alleluia, people are coming in and having the opportunity to actually leaf through their medieval and early modern manuscripts again, so that's really, really good. But understandably, for a long time, we haven't actually had direct access to our collections. I think that's where the beauty of actual digitization comes in. I mean, for the case of books, and particularly medieval books, digitization is a really important process, but it's quite challenging. It takes a long time. Books which are very fragile have to be handled really carefully, have to be prepared by conservators in advance, then have to be imaged, then all the technical aspects of getting them online. But we do have several thousand of our medieval manuscripts, and we have large collections of papyri at the British Library, which are becoming increasingly available online as well. And I think that was really important during lockdown in particular, to enable people to continue their research without actually having to directly physically handle the objects themselves. And of course, that means if you're actually working in Canada, for example, or Western Europe or Australia or any other part of the world, you can actually see the items without actually having to be present at the library. And I think that's a massive boon for researchers today. I mean, certainly when I was doing my studies, didn't have that opportunity. You could only look at manuscripts either at the library in question, or occasionally if a black and white facsimile had been produced. So that's a big difference. I'd also make a little plug for the Medieval Manuscripts blog as well, because I think that's also a really good vehicle for actually engaging with people who aren't actually specialists at all. People who might just be interested in sort of medieval culture, or just literally interested in the pretty pictures that they can see. And it also, interestingly, the kinds of people who actually do use our manuscripts, often they might be involved in the creative arts. They might be jewelers, or they might be musicians who are. I remember a lady who came to the library. She was composing a piece for the reburial of King Richard III, who had been his body had been found buried beneath a car park in Leicester, and his body was being reinterred, reburied at Leicester Cathedral, and she'd been tasked with creating a new piece for his reburial. So she wanted to come and see some manuscripts which were connected with him, just to get a sense of what the man was like. Or recently, another a designer created a fashion designer did his sort of a big piece for London Fashion Week, featured designs from some of our Elizabethan manuscripts. I just think that's really fantastic. It's fascinating. And I think it goes to show that you don't just have to be a kind of a specialist in medieval Latin literature to find medieval manuscripts and that particular period of history so fascinating.
I think that's really interesting and really important, first of all, because it shows that you can become involved with libraries and museums from different perspectives. And I think sometimes, especially the British Library, maybe it can be daunting. So you might not think you have the background to go there or something like that. The last thing I wanted to ask you is if you had any advice for people who want to get into libraries, museums, that kind of thing.
The first thing I'd always say is, anybody who comes across as really enthusiastic, keen, determined, dogged, these are all characteristics which will help you, get on the ladder into museum employment. And certainly my experience from talking to lots of people in London and in the UK is that being able maybe to do an internship or volunteering for your local museum, becoming involved in some community project, is a really, really effective way and a good way of gaining experience. You might not immediately recognise that it might not be the most sort of might not be what you ultimately think is your career destination. But I really think that it's not only does it show willing, but it also gives you the opportunity to find out how the museum works, how it ticks, how life happens in the background. And I've mentioned this as well, but being really determined. I mean, obviously never give up, but being looking across the museum sector and the library sector and looking at all the different kinds of roles and the different kinds of different opportunities that there might be in museums. Obviously, it depends and it differs on the size of a museum, but there are lots of different jobs that might be in conservation, or it might be in marketing, or it might be working in the front of house or the events team, or it might be working in the loans registry, or it might be working in the press team, might be working in exhibitions. These are all jobs which are all allied to what we do as curators, and we all work together. We all work as part of a team. We don't work individually. We are working as part of a greater organisation. And I would definitely say to anybody, really keen and eager to work in museums, is to keep your options open. But particularly, even if there's a particular discipline that you want to work in and you find it difficult, there might be lots of competition. Don't give up, but also, think how your skills and experiences might be useful in other contexts. And ultimately, I just say good luck and keep trying until you find the roles that really suit you.
That's really great. Thank you, Julian. And thanks for chatting today.
Absolute pleasure. Lovely to talk to you, Emily.
So Julian brought forth some really important points in relation to collection work. The first thing that struck me was that he was very supportive of other institutions. Maybe you saw that he referenced the Library of Congress, the National Library. I think that's really important to recognize, which is people in the sector that work together for the common goal of spreading knowledge. And making sure everything is accessible. So if it's not accessible at the current location you're in, they'll make sure they do everything in your power to make sure you get the information you're in need of. You'll find that within institutions themselves as well. As Julian said, there's always conversation between the exhibit team, the events team, and the curator. You're never alone in a project. There's always somebody to back you up, and that's what I want people to realize about the museum field as well, which is that you're not confined to a collection space. Another thing that became really apparent in our discussion was the international reach of the British Library. There were 2 points which really highlighted that, which is the Medieval Manuscripts blog. He mentioned that a lot. I think that's really important for making sure collections are accessible and sort of presenting your history in a different way, presenting your collections in a different way. Another thing I thought was really interesting was when Julian said that the reading rooms have more of an international visitorship. That's really interesting too, because as I stated in the last lecture, that museums, their mandate is to make sure knowledge is accessible. So anyone who's not familiar with a place would find that really encouraging. Lastly, by way of recap, I wanted to highlight something that Julian said, which is that every object has a life after it's donated. It doesn't stop being important after it's in the collection. I really like the idea that every time something is viewed or every time something is smelled or touched, that the life of the object changes, the essence of it changes. It's also really important to realize that every bit of research can have an impact on the object too. As he stated, sometimes you can do research and then that can impact somebody researching on the other side of the world. I think that's really interesting too, and that's the power of museums and the power of online collections or posting what you find out in a museum. Everything can have an impact. These museum interviews are meant to be a discussion and a reflection aspect of this course. So as part of this, I'm going to be leaving a discussion forum on the Google Classrooms for you to leave your thoughts and questions of the interviews. So I hope you'll use that tool, and I'll bring any responses I get to Julian. Thanks for joining me today.